Sup, everybody? This is Karak with ACG. You might know me from my award-winning brand new invention, the Baser, the baby taser, when swaddling just won't do. Actually, today we're going to cover a little bit about something that I think is really interesting for the industry as a whole. So this is Reviewer Bits covering HDR, High Dynamic Range Lighting. Why am I covering it? Well, because Xbox S is going to output it, and people freaked out, and they kept emailing me going, what's HDR? I don't understand. Why is Microsoft talking about this? Why do I care? Well, you do care because it's actually pretty cool, but I get it. It's actually a little bit difficult to understand. So I sent a bunch of people to the wiki, and then they emailed me back and said, hey, so again, what is HDR? I went and looked at the wiki, and I was like, yeah, that's probably not the best way to describe it to people. So I'm going to give you guys some examples, purely generic samples, examples of how HDR can affect the picture, but just overall, what kind of jump I think that we are expecting in the overall look of your picture themselves once you have an HDR output and input. HDR, high dynamic range lighting, what does that mean? Well, let's be honest. Every time you buy a new camera and you take a picture, that camera looks a little different. That picture, looks a little different, right? Every picture takes, or every camera takes a little bit of a different picture. So adjusting for that is sort of trying to make sure that your color spectrum is right and your lighting spectrum is right. When it comes to HDR, what you're trying to do is sort of more accurately reflect the luminosity that the human eye can actually see natively. When you take a picture, you never really capture all of that lighting information, or if you do, you can't display it on whatever device. What this does is HDR output and input is allows you to get that information and actually output it onto a display that is actually compatible with it or native with it. We'll discuss that later. So the easiest way for me to describe it is this. If you consider the luminosity scale of 1 to 10, 1 being jet black, 10 being the brightest white, what HDR simply does is it adds numbers between the whole numbers. So instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, you have 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3, 3.5. The cool thing about HDR is, though, it's way more information than that. It's that jump that you see when you go from 480, let's say, to 1080, or even 1080 to 4K resolution. It's a massive jump in information and luminosity. Now, a lot of people are like, I don't really understand how that's going to actually make my picture better. And unfortunately, the examples you're going to see if you look up HDR photographs and stuff, many times those are actually done with really shitty software that isn't true HDR. There's some issues there. So I'm going to give you a couple situations in your own lives that you might have experienced what I think you're going to see here with HDR in your normal lives when you are adjusting computer stuff. For example, when you get a TV or you get a display, how many times are those settings right for your home? 0. I can't remember the last time I bought a display and went, yep, boom, those settings are right. No, what happens is you turn it on. What happens? If you have a black screen or you have super dark shadows, there's usually the darkest dark is many times gray instead of jet black, or you have shadows which are all black instead of a little bit of gray. You don't have that separation of light. So what you have to do is you have to grab your controller and you have to use these arcane settings to set your contrast and your brightness and maybe your color tinting a little bit, right? Okay. Well, what HDR does is it just offers more separation to all of those settings. Indeed, one of the cool things about this is if you've ever used an HTC Vive or you've ever used an Oculus Rift and you jump into a game, especially if you've used Vorpix, which I've covered before, where it takes a normal game and makes it work with the HTC Vive or the Rift. But if you play those games, you now have depth. You have true depth, or 3D glasses for the most part, though they're not the best. But you have true depth between 2 pixels, right? In many ways, it's the easiest way to describe what's going on here is you're going to have more depth between those pixels. What that's going to do is allow for a more vibrant, more informational picture for the human eye. That is what matters. You will actually be seeing more luminosity information in your screen than you saw prior. And we've all done that. We've all turned on a TV and changed it, and then you almost visibly went, oh, thank you, I've got the settings right. You know that it's almost like a tenseness that you feel when the settings are off. You're like, oh, and then once everything feels right, you're like, oh, okay, that's great. Yeah, that's it looks good. It looks more accurate. And there's a reason why, because your eyes know what's accurate and what's not. When you see that originally, you're like, the fuck, this is completely messed up. And then you change it, your eyes are like, okay, this looks much more realistic. And then you move on and you now have a monitor that's somewhat calibrated. So HDR does the same thing, but a vastly, vastly improved picture. Now, unfortunately, what you have is compatibility versus native HDR. Now, compatibility mode is going to pretty much go away, I think, quite quickly. But what it is right now is that some TVs are labeling themselves HDR, and when you look, it's a compatible HDR. It's not a true HDR. It takes some of the information and not all of it, and then sort of fakes it. True HDR is a spec 2020 is what it's called, and you can look that up on Wiki. And spec 2020 is the spec that TVs are going to try to attain, and if they do the steps within the spec, they will be HDR compliant, which includes all of that luminosity information and no fakery. We already have TVs that do this, Vizio P series, and I think some of their M series do this. I don't believe they have any fake ones. I believe those are all accurate, but you can certainly go to their website, or you can certainly go to the wiki and you can check that out. Why does all this matter? Well, unfortunately, it matters for later. It doesn't matter as much now, but the reason why it matters so much is because I think it's really cool that this is a spec that will be natural moving forward. It's not owned by AMD, and it's not owned by NVIDIA. It's not owned by Microsoft or Sony. This is an improvement in your overall picture that will be viable regardless of what graphics card you get once all these graphics cards come out and all these systems come out that natively display it. And you will just have a base level improvement to your picture, a vast improvement to the picture. Why do I say vast? Well, studies have shown that 4K is more noticeable added difference when HDR is applied to the same picture. And that is one of the things I can say. If you have a chance, if you have any stores near you that sell TVs or anything like that, go to that store, make sure that they have a good signal going to these fucking TVs, because sometimes stores love to just have the same signal split 26 times, but go there. And if you're lucky enough, you can usually ask the person to see an HDR TV and a non-HDR TV both at 4K, because they do exist. And if that's possible, the difference will be dramatic. Now, don't let them do this. Don't let them show you a 4K TV with HDR and show you a picture on it that simulates non-HDR and HDR. That's fakery. Same thing with if you are on a non-HDR TV and they try to show you the difference between the two. You need to see them side by side on their own native display devices. That's where you see the true contrast, lighting, brightness, and luminosity differences. So, what is HDR really going to do? Well, it's just going to improve the information that you get. You know, when you take that picture, like I said, you're not collapsing and collecting all that data. And here now you will be collecting a ton more, and you will be displaying that on your screen. The jump to me personally in HDR is equal easily to 1080p to 1440p. And most likely, I personally feel it's equal to 1080p to 4K. That's how big HDR is to me. HDR lighting is something that we really haven't seen. You know, back in the day when they were changing the bit rate of colors or bits of colors, and 8-bit color, 16-bit, that kind of thing, we saw some pretty dramatic improvements, VGA. But we sort of stopped for a very long time. It's just like, okay, we sort of stopped, and you now have your color spectrum, and that's it. Now we're getting this new thing, and HDR is fantastic, and I think anybody who gets a chance to check it out should do so, because it is the future. The Neo's going to do it, the Scorpio's going to do it, the Xbox S is going to do it, and I'm sure any video card releasing from now on in the future will cover it as well. So again, make sure you have a display device, a source device, video card, or control or gaming system, and a display device that displays it. Otherwise, well, something's going to be fucked up. So anyway, that's it for me. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope in some way it explained a little bit about HDR, which to a lot of people can be a little bit confusing. So anyway, that's it for me. I hope you guys liked the video. As always, if you did, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, give it a thumbs down. And peace out and enjoy the rest of your weekend.